It is extremely expensive for companies to build a product, make it available to the public, and then realize people are not able to use it because of design or workflow errors. In my experience, this doesn't happen because the makers are short-sighted. Instead, it happens because early on in the development process, they did not engage with users. Invite users into your creation process. In this video, we will learn about a few methods that you can use to make sure that people are able to use your product even before it is released into the public. We will also deep dive into one method I frequently follow as a user researcher at Microsoft. I find myself frequenting this method because of its effectiveness. By effectiveness, I mean the kind of efforts that I put in versus the kind of value my team gets out of the insights. That is what makes this method worth pursuing. Alright, so the first method is performing a heuristic evaluation. This sounds technical and complicated, right? It's not. Heuristic basically means learning something for yourself, doing it hands-on and then creating your takeaways out of it. So in this method, you need to invite a few experts, and in this case, you are the expert, where they will use rules of thumbs to measure how usable an interface or an app is. You must perform a few tasks and cover some basic workflow that you want to test. You and your team can decide what are those key workflows that need to be tested. And typically under these 10 parameters, you would have to report certain issues that come up. So let's talk about error prevention in this case. Look at this screen from the IRCTC app. The IRCTC app is the Indian Railway ticket booking app. So here, every time I would try to check the status of my ticket, I would almost always accidentally click on cancel ticket, which is the exact opposite of what I want to do. I just want to get a sense of whether my ticket has gone from under the waiting list into the reserved category. But because these two buttons are placed so close together, it's highly likely that I would accidentally click on cancel ticket. Fun fact, this is also, by the way, called fat finger syndrome. That got popularized back in the days when people used to use Blackberries and you had those tiny keys on the keypad. So while performing this task, I would rate error prevention as poor and explain why in the report. Just like that, the experts or you will be requested to cover some workflows where the feedback is required, and basis these 10 parameters, you can rate them high, medium, low, poor, good, not good. You can choose the scale that you want to rate these 10 parameters on. And feel free to create like an Excel sheet that says task 1, task 2, task 3, and parameter 1, 2, and 3, and then you start writing down whether that was high or low, and then you mention why did you give it that rating. And that's typically a good way to sort of collect data when you're doing a heuristic evaluation. Moving on to the next method, now we have conducting cognitive walkthroughs. Please don't let the scientific jargon intimidate you or discourage you from using this. Cognitive just means anything that requires you to apply your memory, perception, or do some bit of analysis. So doing your homework, cooking, drawing something out of memory, or using an app are a couple of examples of what a cognitive activity would curtail. And having certain types of attitudes, temperaments, or personalities would be considered non-cognitive phenomena. You do need some bit of cognition to exhibit non-cognitive phenomena, but it's more indirect, so that's why the classification is the way it is. So coming back to cognitive walkthroughs, a team of reviewers would walk through an app or a product. They perform a few tasks, and after each step of a task flow, they answer a set of prescribed questions. So for example, if Uber wants to test what is it like to urgently book a cab to the airport for a new user, after performing the task, the reviewer would have to answer a free predetermined questions, right? And in this case, it could be, was the user able to achieve the right effect? Were they actually able to book a ride till the airport? Did the book now or book an Uber, find your Uber, is that button or that action distinctly, clearly visible? Will the user recognize the action as correct one? So does the user experience high confidence or low confidence when trying to book the Uber? And once the Uber is booked, does the user understand the feedback from the system? So does the user understand how much money they are paying, how long is it taking their Uber to arrive, what are the specifications for the vehicle that they have booked, and what is the pickup and the drop point, so on and so forth. So these are some examples of how these predetermined questions can be contextualized for the use case for Uber or this particular example. You can sort of curate these predetermined questions based on your use case as well. But make sure that it's very, very context specific and all the stakeholders from your team are aligned about what kind of questions do you want to ask after each task. All right, moving to the next example, we have experience benchmarking. So similar to a cognitive walkthrough, you can perform an experience benchmark as well. In the previous two studies, those studies can be done by people in your team. This one, I personally recommend inviting real users from outside your organization to perform a couple of tasks. There are various ways to use this method. You can get your users to perform the same set of tasks on a competitive app and learn about what is the compete or how are users experiencing the compete and that is working out for them, versus you can also have users perform the same set of tasks on your platform and learn about what is going wrong when people try to do the same kind of things on your app. So the way I would collect data for this particular exercise is I would again have a predetermined set of questions. So for this one, the questions could look like, were the users able to perform this task? How many attempts did it take them before they could complete the task? How easy or difficult was it to do? And how confident did they feel while performing the task? How long did they feel it takes to perform that particular task? And then each row could represent the data that has come in for task A, B, C, and D. And that way you can collect responses from 1 to 10, 15, however many users as you'd like. Alright, so finally for the deep dive, we have moderated usability testing. If you've done any bit of UX research, it's highly likely that this is the first method any new user researcher employs. And it's predominantly because this method is highly effective, pretty straightforward, and very, very intuitive for everybody involved to understand. So you find users, you ask them to perform a few tasks over a video call. They think out loud while performing these tasks. Wait for them to complete a particular task and ask follow-up questions about their experience of doing X, Y, and Z on the app. So pre-pandemic, I used to perform these studies in person, and typically there would be an elaborate clinical looking research lab, but with the advent of remote research, we do this over a video call now. And some other time we'll get into the details of the pros and cons of doing a study like this in person versus online. Two things that are extremely critical to manage in a moderated usability study is, one, getting the prototype or the testing environment absolutely right, and two, conducting the session in such a way that it does not interfere with the user's natural way of using a particular app. Now, what exactly does this mean? Let's take a look at how to manage these two aspects of the study properly. So when trying to set up the prototype correctly, it's important to have clear flows and objectives. So if we go back to the example for Uber, if you want to learn about what are the pain points when people are trying to book a particular cab while they are in hurry, so you need to have 3 to 4 or up till 10 workflows that you want to test in a 60 to 90 minute session. Any more than that, it's highly discouraged to spend more than 90 minutes with a user, predominantly because of response fatigue. You begin to get answers that are not an accurate representation of what happens when people are trying to use their app by themselves. So limiting the number of flows that you want to test and having clear objectives as to why you want to test exactly those flows, that really helps the design counterparts to ensure that the prototype is built in a robust manner. Within the prototype, it's highly recommended to use realistic content and use real data. By realistic content, I would mean that if Uber is testing, you would want to create maps from actual locations. And by actual location, it does not need to be a map of London. It could be the map for Hogwarts, but it needs to be a physical place so that people can recognize that the testing is happening for a real person in a real case scenario. The last part is designing for error prevention and support. Let's say your user, while testing, did book a cab on the Uber prototype, and then they realize that they've made an error. They want to go back and fix it, but because it's a prototype, it's not a fully developed app, they struggle a lot just to go back, and all of that frustration can impact the experience that they have, which means that the scores that they'll be giving to those workflows will start dipping. So to make sure that those kind of errors don't happen, it's highly advised that designers create these prototypes in a way that allows for some bit of error prevention, support, some bit of retrieval, so on and so forth. So allow users to go back and forth between the flows, allow them to fix stuff, show them warning signs wherever necessary, as close as the real thing that you can get. It's highly advised to do that. Something that I've very frequently seen in my practice is that whenever people begin to perform a usability test, by perform I mean moderate a usability test, they want to dive right into the prototype and the flows and the feedback, so on and so forth, but it almost always comes at a cost. It's important to create a rapport with the participant to ensure that the participant has eased into the testing format, so that their inhibitions and nervousness does not impact how they perform that particular task. So spending 2-3 minutes in the beginning of the session doing some ice breaking, asking them about where are they joining us from, what is the weather like, what is the time there, just casual chit chat about do they have pets, what do they do for a living, what has their experience been in a context of what you're trying to test. So for Uber, what has their experience been in general with on-demand cab bookings, so on and so forth. So creating rapport and establishing some bit of context really helps ease into the session. So second point, wording instructions judicially, scenarios versus giving them a task. So rather than making users click on button A, B, C, we can ask them to, book a cab to the airport, rather than asking them to book an Uber go to the airport in such a way that the ETA of the cab is 3 seconds or whatever. So that judicial, that intentional wording of instruction is absolutely make or break for your study. You do not want to get super specific and you do not want to get hyper vague as well. More about this in the later part. So another thing you want to ensure is that you ask open-ended questions as much as possible and you avoid close-ended questions. Now, what does this mean? Anybody who's done any bit of research in understanding how to talk to users, you must have come across the word open-ended and closed-ended questions. So examples for open-ended question could look like, can you walk me through the process of doing X, Y, and Z? Instead of asking, can you do X, Y, and Z? So typically, walk me through the process of just having that as a prefix to a sentence. What that does is the person feels freer and they can tell you 10 different things that you haven't imagined is a part of the workflow, right? So let's say I ask somebody, can you walk me through a process of creating a YouTube video? And I am expecting them to tell me that, oh, I open my video editor, I import all of the content, but they can start with, I go to Pinterest and create a vision board or a mood board for the visuals of my YouTube video. Now that information just changes the game for you, and it gives you an opportunity to introduce newer features in the future of your product, right? So can you edit the video with the content that we've given you? That becomes an example of a close-ended question in this context. Another example is, how would you typically perform X, Y, and Z? So rather than asking them while creating a YouTube video, do you tend to do X or do you tend to do Y? So instead of doing that, give the user an opportunity to introduce a Z into the equation. So another open-ended example would be, when you performed this task, did something stand out to you as particularly easy or difficult to do? So asking that instead of, hey, did you find it easy? Was this easy to do? Did you like this? So instead of phrasing your questions in like a closed manner where the person can only answer with, yeah, it was fine, or no, this was not, or making the person biased or inclined to say, oh yeah, this was easy now that I think about it. Instead of doing that, we want to make sure that the language is a little inclusive. It's open-ended, it's not biasing them to lean towards one or the other. Another example is, we ask them, what was your expectation when you clicked on XYZ, right? Instead of asking them, were you not expecting this to happen? Another example is, what stood out to you when you performed X, Y, and Z? Instead of, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you like X, Y, and Z, right? So if you'll notice that the best practices for creating an open-ended question list is that you want to frame the questions in positives, so not using words like cannot or just negatives in general. So everything should be articulated in positives. Anytime you're using an adjective, like this was easy or difficult to do, this was frustrating or simple, intuitive or obtrusive, you want to make sure that you introduce both sides of both examples of the adjective, so opposing examples of the adjective. Another thing you want to ensure that you do is that you use phrases like walk me through the process. So you try to include words like process, workflow, typically, how do you normally, so on and so forth, to make them feel like we are trying to learn about their usual everyday use case rather than expecting them to perform a certain thing in this test environment. So now that you have the basics in place, go ahead and create a discussion guide, your prototype, and follow the steps we talked about in the previous video. If you haven't familiarized yourself with the research process we spoke about in the last video, follow the link in the description to watch it. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, and stay tuned to learn more.